what can the international community realistically do in a situation where there's really little on the ground control? It's not like there's UN peacekeepers that are getting deployed.
Mhm.
Hello?
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, it's going fantastic. Well, no, it's not going fantastic. I was raging at other streamers. That's never good. Never good.
Yeah, I just tuned in for the last 10 minutes. I can understand your frustrations, but yeah,
Okay, so I'm
streaming
not
drama.
being stupid here. Like my critique is like I'm upset for a good reason though, right?
No, I 100% agree. You're correct. You're definitely upset for a good reason. I think the way you try to get into the details of what is and isn't an actual war crime, and like I tuned in basically when you started talking about like, when people when it's kind of legitimate to maybe attack a school or a hospital that's been occupied and stuff like that. And something I saw in the past, especially earlier on, even before the conflict in Sudan, I remember there was lots of controversy about similar stuff happening in like Palestine and Israel. And yeah, a lot of people aren't kind of aware about the nuances of what is and isn't a war crime.
I love
But
the
I think,
hmm?
Mhm.
No, continue.
No, yeah, I think you're kind of correct. Towards the end, like you were being charitable to Hassan in saying that his main concern might just be like just the civilian deaths and criticizing what is acceptable collateral damage. And I guess by law, it's not a crime. You can call it like an ethical or moral crime, but that's just very subjective, and everyone will have whatever their own kind of rule is for what is acceptable or unacceptable.
Yeah, like I mean, if and people can say like I would never ever approve a strike that would kill a civilian, and me personally, this is an immense weight to put on anyone's shoulders to ask them to
Hmm.
press a button that would end up killing a civilian. But anyone could draw up any million different scenarios where it's like, okay, well, I guess in that situation, like, hey, this is ISIS headquarters and they're about to do a suicide bombing. There's like 10 of them, suicide bombs,
Hmm.
about to go into a mall full of 1,000 people. And if they don't strike, even though it's going to kill this like one grandma that's next to them, like, what do you do? Some people are going to
Hmm.
press that button and you can say that like, oh my God, the horror. But at the end of the day, there's a decent chance they just saved the lives of hundreds of people by making that extremely difficult decision that's probably going to haunt them for the rest of their life. I am not going to be the poor bastard to make that decision though. I couldn't imagine being in that position.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's a very difficult situation. People always talk about the trolley problem, right? And
Yeah.
I think recently there's been discussions on why it's pointless for most people to even waste their time thinking about the trolley problem. But for, like you said, for some minority of people in some very rare instances, something similar might manifest in their decision making. And yes, I don't want to be them, and it's never easy. But like the broadest thing is, in the end, is um, what is and what isn't a crime legally. I guess when people did like the Roman Convention and tried to get into the legalities of war, they tried to set like a minimum standard and understand that war is messy. So obviously, not every civilian death is going to be considered a war crime. Unfortunately, it is, but that is how war is. The idea is just to try to govern how people fight wars in a way that avoids unnecessary civilian deaths as much as possible.
Absolutely. Now, my audience is saying introduce you. I want to make sure I introduce you at the start of this segment. Um.
Mhm.
By the way, thank you for coming on to my stream to agree with me. That I love it when my guests come on to reinforce my already pre-existing beliefs. Uh, thank you so much for coming on to today's stream to talk about an extremely important issue that I feel is not getting appropriate attention. That is the ongoing. I don't know if the word is civil war because I hear some people say civil war, but then I hear other people that it might spiral out into a civil war. Whatever it is,
Mhm.
the incredibly violent events that are going on in Sudan. Could you introduce yourself?
All right. Yes. Hi, everyone. Yep. Thanks for having me, Dylan, for a second time over to talk about like the conflict in Sudan. My name is Gassim. I'm an engineering PhD student. I'm just about to graduate, actually. My background is actually in engineering, but I worked at the top think tank basically in Sudan for a couple of years, called the Center for Development and Public Policy. I like basically engaging in politics and look into it a lot of the time.
Thank you very much for coming on. Now we've talked about this conflict before, And
Mhm.
I just want to make sure, though, because some people who are tuning in today probably haven't listened to that talk. They weren't here for that conversation. Didn't see it on YouTube. Didn't see it on Twitch. And so, before we get into the updates about what has happened since we've last had a conversation, I would like you to help us just have a basic rundown of the situation of what is transpiring in Sudan on a basic level.
Mhm. Yeah, so on the basic level, Sudan is trying to go through a transition from like a 30-year kind of autocratic rule, which ruled from 89, which is actually the year I was born, and went on for like basically 30 years. And throughout that transition period, there was like a power sharing agreement between like the opposition parties that were, opposing the previous regime, including the military. And the final kind of party in that power sharing agreement was a former militia known as the RSF, which was then formalized into the government structure. They were called the Janjaweed basically when they were a militia, and then they became the Rapid Support Forces. So those were the parties in the power sharing agreement. And towards the end of the transitional period, the military folks, let's say, both RSF and the actual Sudanese armed forces, kind of did like a soft coup on the civilians. They kicked out all the opposition parties and all the civilian government and took power. Then tensions started to boil up in between them, the RSF, the militia basically, and the Sudanese armed forces, until it broke out in armed conflict on the 15th of April of this year, basically.
Got you. So there was going to be a transition after, I don't want to say the collapse of Omar al-Bashir's government, because it wasn't really the collapse of his government. It was more the collapse of just him. A lot of the people who was with him are still in power. But as Omar al-Bashir, finally was removed from power, and there was conversations of this transition to democracy. There was then this soft coup between the Rapid Support Forces and the armed forces of Sudan. They were working together to try to transition to something. Who knows their exact intentions? Probably not the most pure. Can you tell me who the Rapid Support Forces are? Who are the Janjaweed that they come from? What's their reputation?
Yes, the Rapid Support Forces, the Janjaweed. It's actually kind of in the name, especially if you look at Janjaweed. I think there's a documentary called "The Devil Came on Horseback," and that's more or less the Arabic meaning of Janjaweed. So Jin Ja al Jawad, which is basically the translation of devil came on a horseback, and then it kind of got abbreviated into Janjaweed over time. They're more or less what started off as like a tribal or ethnic group that was fighting in Darfur on behalf of the old regime. They got armed, they got a lot of support, and they grew up basically over time to become a very strong and ferocious militia. They're known to have committed like atrocious war crimes in Darfur during
during the war with the South Sudan
during that.
rebels.
Well, it wasn't South Sudan. It's mainly the Western rebels. The South Sudan, I don't think they were really active on the south side of Sudan. It was mostly Darfur, which is West Sudan. Yeah, because Sudan had like two major, civil wars or like internal conflicts. One was with the South, but that ended around 2006 when they got the 2005, 2006 when they did the comprehensive peace agreement with the South, which eventually led to the South seceding into its own country. But then there was the war with the West, the West rebels in Darfur, and that's the one the army armed supported the Janjaweed with. And it's all under this leader of this charismatic but terrible guy, Ahmed Dagalo. And he was the face of the militia, and then he became the face of the Rapid Support Forces up until the transition. He was basically the number 2 person during the transition because he was the vice president of the transitional council throughout the transitional period. And yes, they committed atrocious war crimes. They're known to have commit scorched earth policies. Whenever they would attack villages in Darfur, they would burn down the villages, kill children, women, old men. They didn't really care. It was horrible.
Got you. So we have on one side this I can't pronounce his full name. That's why I always say Hedmeti. And I can't even pronounce that well. We have him who. How would you describe this guy? I've heard him described as a very power hungry. Will do anything for in pursuance of power. Climbs the he's climbing the ladder rapidly. How would you describe this guy?
Yeah, Hemeti is. I would say he is kind of charismatic. He is not like a educated person. A lot of people make fun of him because he more or less used to be like I think a camel or sheep herder somewhere in Darfur. But yes, over time he became very ambitious. Like from the time when he started like his tiny militia in Darfur, he rose very rapidly because he went from just being some random person to the head of a non-formalized militia. By the time it was 2013, it got formalized when Bashir actually pushed the Sudanese parliament to sign a law that basically made them a formalized paramilitary. And then by the time it was 2019, his ambitions had kind of grown when he saw that Bashir was on his way out. He sided with I don't know, like side is a very strong term, but he basically did not help al-Bashir stave off the revolution. He kind of just took a back seat and the power came into him because by that point he was kind of strong. He had already fought a war in Yemen. He had some regional allies in like the UAE. So yeah, his ambitions are limitless, but also his economic resources, which has allowed him to deploy a bunch of experts, global experts actually, in like communications and public relations and lobbying groups like in Canada and in Europe. I think not in the US, but definitely like in Canada, Europe, and other European countries.
Got you. And so I just we're kind of rehashing a lot of old ground, but I want to make sure that if anybody's watching this with no idea what we're talking about, that they have something to go off of. And on the other side of this conflict, we have the armed forces, the Sudanese armed forces, the formalized military.
Mm-hmm.
Who is leading them? What's he like?
Yeah, so the formalized military is led by General Burhan. When the revolution happened, Bashir was taken out. They announced some other general to succeed after him to lead the army, and that other name was not acceptable to like the people kind of who brought forth the revolution, but I think also it was not acceptable to like regional powers who were interested in like the future of Sudan. So his name I think was Ibn Auf. He only lasted for like a few hours before Burhan was then nominated, and to a large extent, a lot of people believe Al Burhan only came into power due to his relationship with Hemeti, and Hemeti would not basically oppose Al Burhan because both of them went back. They had a relationship from their time in Darfur because Burhan was active basically in Darfur as part of the military, not part of the militia. So they had like an old relationship, and for the most part, a lot of people thought they were, tight. They were good friends until things just went south earlier this year.
Okay, so when did things go south earlier this year? What happened?
So according to most reporting, there had a lot of been some tensions from quite early this year, like around January or February. Both of them had stopped speaking together. But then by March, things got really tense. The RSF was kind of not obeying orders anymore. They started doing a bunch of movements within Sudan, like they surrounded one of Sudan's military airports in the north side. It's called Marawi Airport, and that's when the tensions were kind of at the peak. Then, pretty much the next day, which was like the 15th of April, some fighting broke out in the south side of Khartoum, and yeah, Hemeti basically, I mean, a few hours later, went on TV, basically cursing Burhan personally and calling him all sorts of inappropriate names on TV and saying that he was gonna bring him to justice and arrest him. You could see that he felt betrayed for whatever reason. He felt like there was some personal betrayal of some agreements they had. And that's when, the fighting actually broke out on like the 15th of April.
Got you. So the fighting breaks out. There's this power struggle between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces, none of which are particularly inclined to democracy, even though they both say that they're going to transition to democracy. Do you think either of them, like when they say that they're going to, transition to democracy, do you think there's any truth to the word the words they're saying?
No, not at all. It's kind of apparent, like in their actions. Yeah, as you say, actions speak louder than words. The RSF or Hemeti is claiming he's fighting because so when the coup happened on the 25th of October back in 2021, Hemeti already kind of started to see that the winds weren't blowing that favor. So a few months after that, he was like, yeah, he tried to put all the blame of the coup on Burhan and kind of withdraw and say like, yep, that was a wrong thing to do, and we need to do something else about it. But he is definitely not particularly interested in democracy. You can tell by his actions and by what he's been doing. And even when the fighting started on the south side of Khartoum, people are still arguing about who shot the first bullet and who initiated the conflict or the war. But it doesn't really matter because in the end, 2 hours later, he had decided that he was taking all of Sudan under his control, which isn't something you would do like immediately if you were particularly interested in democracy or bringing democracy. The army is definitely not interested in bringing democracy, as we saw, because they did the soft coup on the civilians. They literally just kicked everyone out, and yeah, they just consolidated power. And the issue is it's causing actually a lot of problems right now in terms of trying to figuring out the legitimacy of like who has the the legal and let's say moral ground to sound on in terms of like the fighting that's happening in Sudan, because the Burhan doesn't have like proper legal or moral legitimacy because he just did a coup and took over power. So just puts him on the grounds of any random dictator or autocrat. But at the same time, the militia is just a militia of very ferocious rabid fighters who have definitely zero. It's just even less legitimacy and moral grounds to stand on compared to the army.
So last time we talked, the conflict was I wouldn't say in its necessarily its early stages, but we're at the like beginning weeks. We weren't like as deep as we are now. At the time, we kind of both acknowledged, there's only so much we can judge by what's happened so far about who's got the upper hand, who doesn't have the upper hand. A lot has happened since then. How has the situation changed from when we last talked about the conflict?
So in terms of like control of like let's say physical locations, nothing much has changed. Like for the most part, the militia still controls most of the capital and some parts of Darfur and some parts of like the South Sudan, and the military controls the rest. There's been lots of like big skirmishes where occasionally the militia takes up some grounds and the military also takes up some grounds, but for the most part, I'd say things have been at an equilibrium there. But in a broader sense, things have changed from like a political perspective, I say, because the militia has been kind of doing, let's say, all sorts of war crimes. Speaking of war crimes, in Khartoum and also in Darfur. There's actually been, I'm not sure if you've seen the news recently, but Ajinene is part of Darfur, and there's been like thousands of deaths there. And they just recently uncovered like a mass grave with like 87 people from like the same tribe that opposes the militia. And the ICC said they're going to open an investigation into possible war crimes, like in Ajinene in Darfur. So definitely, like the global scene has kind of started to go against RSF. So they've lost a lot of political, let's say, backing due to their actions in Khartoum. But in terms of the situation,
sorry to interrupt you for a moment, but the thing is, like, every time I tune into this conflict, the rapid support forces have committed another war crime, and that's not to say that the military hasn't committed war crimes. They certainly have. A lot of their bombing has been, I would say, not the most accurate, to put it lightly. But like every day you hear another story. The last story I heard was of a mayor who just like criticized the RSF getting kidnapped and tortured and then executed by them.
Yes.
And pictures of it just surfacing online. Like anybody who speaks out against them, they're going to go drag through the street and shoot them and kill them. And even if you don't criticize them, you might get, just somehow get on their bad side, or there's just a complete disregard of civilian casualties and almost like just like enjoyment and like the kind of like terror that they engage in. Because the thing that really gets me about a lot of these war crime videos when I watch the RSF is like they're smiling and laughing and having a great time as they're committing these war crimes. The only thing that it reminds me of is like, I don't know if you know of the Ranger Brigade from like World War II, of all these like criminals that they took out of German prisons and then sent into the field to like engage in anti-partisan activity in Belarus. They were some of the worst murderers and slaughterers, and they loved it because, you know, of their background. That's the only thing that I can like correlate it to in my head.
I mean, yeah, it makes sense the correlation exists because for the most part, the RSF is a bunch of like they used to be highway robbers and bandits, and a lot of them are just actually career criminals. And you see, if you have also seen like the videos, a lot of them are like kind of younger in age. They had no like proper education, and yeah, and they come also from a culture that kind of glorifies violence and has very little regard for human life. Like they do not care basically about the human life. I think some people are joking. I'm not sure if it's a joke, but it's actually a story I read about someone that one of these young RSF people kind of slapped the older gentleman, and then the other RSF guy was like, "No, this is not right. You shouldn't slap like an old guy. It's not right. You should shoot him." You see, so yeah, it's not the best logic, but yeah, it's just very little regard for human life.
So the international situation when it comes to the how they're viewing the RSF, the more the RSF shows who they are, the more international pressure against them has built, or at least opposition to them has built. But
Correct.
even though there's opposition, what can the international community realistically do in a situation where there's really little on the ground control? It's not like there's UN peacekeepers that are getting deployed.
Yeah, it is kind of difficult. I guess a lot of it has been to a lot of effort have been put into put pressure on the regional countries that are providing support, like to the RSF, and try to cut off their like supply chains for like they have a big like gold smuggling operation where they just smuggle out gold from Sudan. So they've kind of been trying to clamp down on that. In addition to their PR work, they hire a lot of firms and people to do PR work for them. So I guess there's been efforts to try to clamp down on that. But
wait, the RSF. Wait. I'm sorry. I need to pause you there. The RSF has hired a PR firm.
Yeah, they have a big PR firm out operating out of Canada. They paid some big Canadian PR firm to do PR for them. They're very good at it, honestly. If you look at like the way
they must have hired like the guys that help with like Blizzard, you know, after their scandal stuff. They must have hired some real experts or something, because they I mean, I don't know how you take a bunch of like rapists and criminals and like mass murderers, like basically genocidal maniacs, and you give them a makeover. That's a very difficult job for a PR firm.
I know, but they've also been very good at it. I say the PR firm has definitely been a good investment on MIT's part because they now have he has a bunch of like political advisors and media trained people who speak like for the RSF across the globe on media. They release press releases in like fluent English. They have very well managed social media accounts, probably better managed than the armies. So yeah, I guess it was money.
I mean, I see the RSF stuff more than I see the actual army stuff on like Twitter and like on other platforms. Their accounts do seem to be more active, but I'm imagining like they have people that speak for the RSF. I can't imagine that they have like, you know, those CNN interviews where they got one person on one side of the issue on like to the right of the host, and another one on the other host, and then they ask them both questions. I can't imagine like one of those interviews going well where they're like, so here's videos of one of your people executing a civilian. So yeah, what do you think about that? Like, kind of hard to wrap my head around.
I mean, I'll tell you what they say. So what they do is a combination of deny. So one of their most common arguments is that no, these aren't our people. These are the old regime who are dressed up as our people committing some of the crimes. And then when there is no doubt it's like one of the people, then the other thing is no, these are just like they've gone rogue and they will be brought to justice once the war is over or whatever. That's basically their approach to that.
That reminds me of something else I gotta say after working here for a bit. Wow, man. Yeah, no. So they just God damn, that reminds me so much of the Russians actually.
Mm.
Well, for would you say that that this PR firm? I'm sorry, the PR firm is super interesting. I just is very like PR firms for mass murderers is very interesting. Would you say the PR firm has actually benefited them when it comes to the international community's view of them, or at least the international response to the RSF?
Um, yes. So the PR firm didn't start after the war. They like Hemeti kind of hired it earlier on to develop, relationships and work on the RSS public image. And at that point, I think it was working. Like just before the war broke out, the PR firm had kind of managed to rebrand the RSF from like the old days as Janjaweed. People had stopped actually calling them Janjaweed, and they were now kind of considered this paramilitary, disciplined paramilitary force that is very efficient and well funded, and so on and so forth. But yes, as soon as fighting broke out and then a little bit of chaos was introduced, they just went back to the roots of being like a barbaric militia. And yes, it's much harder for the PR firm to do anything at that point. But yeah, I'm not sure actually what they are doing at this point. But I can definitely see that their social media is much more organized and um, let's say more disciplined, like than the armies.
Got you. So moving over back over to the army. What has the army tried to do when it comes to the international community since we've last talked? Have they tried to rally more support? Because we do know that there are players in the region that support both sides here. So
Mm-hmm.
have they been able to rally support behind themselves in any way?
The army is very bad at, let's say, foreign policy. They have not. They've been basically making more enemies because whenever whether regional or even global powers have tried to kind of mediate or send like working to end the conflict, they've just been saying no and accusing whatever entity of kind of having sympathy for the RSF. Eventually, I think they've accused basically every possible entity other than maybe Egypt of having like sympathies towards the RSF, maybe Egypt and Saudi Arabia, because they are having negotiations in Saudi Arabia. And yeah, they're generally just not good at foreign policy. I wouldn't say they're not good at anything. And it's an army. Like, I wouldn't expect them to be good at any of this stuff because they're an army. The only issue is they're an army that decided to take it upon themselves to become the state and govern the country, which they shouldn't be doing. And they're not very good at it because, they're just army people.
Yeah, they're supposed to know how
Uh,
to kill people, not like
yeah,
manage taxes.
no, or like have like proper foreign relations, or like manage your social media, as an example, as we're just saying, or like healthcare. Right now, there's a big issue in like healthcare in Sudan. Um, yeah, it's a whole like big issue. For example, there was a very recent controversy because a Facebook page which says the state ministry of health reported that an army attack killed 17 civilians, and people freaked out. And then I guess it became very popular. It was on the news, like the Secretary General of the UN retweeted it and discussed it, and that's kind of considered a problem. And I see a lot of people in Sudan forgot about, they weren't super angry about the airstrike itself. Some people were, but most people were angry is that a Facebook page was you know working against the army. What's supposed to be like an official state page was working against the army, and what turned out to be what was happening on the background was that this particular Facebook page was official and is part of the original government that the army did a coup against, and they never gave him like the password. They never relinquished control over the Facebook page.
What?
So
Really?
yeah, yeah,
So you're saying
yep,
that that's still controlled by what was originally the transitionary kind of government?
yes,
So
exactly.
so the only real semi-civilian mandated control
Yeah.
is Facebook pages and like Twitter accounts.
Yeah, some of them, yes. So that was the state, like the state of Khartoum's Ministry of Health page, and they're the ones that reported the 17 deaths from the airstrike. Um, And then then people started fighting. Instead of fighting about whether the army should have 17 casualties in some random airstrike, they were fighting about who should actually be controlling that Facebook page and who has legitimacy. And it's like, oh, this army that just did a coup, or these opposition parties which weren't elected either but came into power like through a revolutionary process. So it's a very messy situation, like, to say the least.
So I want to ask you, I know you said that the military situation hasn't changed that much. Are there any changes that are notable, and are there any things that we should be looking out for as this continues to? I want to ask you, what should we call it? Because I see people calling it different things. I think that it looks like a civil war. I don't think that would be too crazy to call it a civil war. Well, what do you call it?
I generally just call it like armed conflict. A lot of people do not want to call it a civil war because it's not between like specific ethnic groups or like specific regions within the country. It's just like this one militia against the army. And those people actually advocate to call it just like a mutiny or a rebellion, an armed rebellion. They don't even like the idea of like armed conflict, because they say it puts like a false equivalency between the two parties, and they're not equivalent like in terms of legitimacy or whatever. And they definitely don't like people calling it a civil war, because then it kind of means that the militia has like some control over some region or represents some region in Sudan or some ethnic group in Sudan, which they wholeheartedly disagree with. I don't really care about the semantics too much. I definitely call it just an armed conflict, and I don't care about people who say like you're creating like a false equivalency, because there's no two parties in the conflict. But obviously, all conflicts have to have two parties. It's okay if you think one party has less legitimacy to engage in the conflict, but it's definitely just an armed conflict between two parties.
So I wanna go back to the other question I said before I interrupted with a separate question. So I just have a lot to ask. You said the situation on the ground militarily hasn't changed that much. Is there any changes that are notable or things that we should look out for as the situation continues to develop?
So one of the big, yes, it's gonna be a problem if the militia manages to take over like some key bases, like in Khartoum, specifically if they manage to take over like air bases or like the heavy machinery bases, like where they store all the tanks and some of the heavier equipment. We call it silah mudarrat. And that's where a lot of the fighting has actually been happening recently, because the army wants to make sure like the militia can't take over that. What they have been able to take over is like smaller, let's say strategic institutes where they have managed to like restock. They've managed to take over like in Khartoum, where weapons are manufactured. So the main issue is they don't want to run out of, let's say, ammo and arms. So they've been targeting places where they can restock. Which kind of indicates that they can keep fighting, because a lot of people have been banking on the idea that the military is trying to starving off like from supplies and cut out their supply chains. But since Khartoum is just heavily armed, they just, whenever I guess they run low on weapons, they just attack whatever installation they know has a good amount of like ammo and arms they can restock from. At the same time, the military has.
It reminds me of early ISIS, when ISIS would kind of just raid prisons for new fighters and like raid different like army outposts for new guns and new ammunition.
Yeah, and that's basically what the RSF does. So the RSF is very mobile unit. That's its main strength. So
rapid
it will
support
not.
Forces. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I think their slogan is readiness, speed, and decisiveness. جاهزية سرعة حسم. So they're ready, they're fast, and they're decisive. So yeah, they just come in, they take over whatever installation they need at any given point, and then they leave whenever they've achieved their objective. Because they can't hold anything for a long time, especially with the military controlling a significant air force and able to do like airstrikes. But the military, on the other hand, has achieved some victories. Specifically, they managed to take over a key bridge, I think Halfaya Bridge in Khartoum, which was used by the RSF for to restock and as part of the supply chain. But for the main part, they still, like I said, not much has changed. It would be a big problem if the RSF takes over some of the bigger bases, because That way, they will consolidate. Oh, also, they have not taken control of the general command of the armed forces. They've surrounded it, and it's been surrounded since the war started, but they've not been able to take over the general command. So those are key things that if they do take over, then they can consolidate, I guess, their grip on Khartoum, and from there they can move outwards. It's very unlikely because they've been bleeding, fighters. They've been bleeding.
Who has been bleeding fighters? The rep support
The
forces?
militia.
Yeah.
No, yes, the rapid support forces. Yes, yeah. So I don't think they will be able to move out. Their best hope, in my estimate, is just to kind of stay in Khartoum and act as a thorn and try to just negotiate their way out of this.
So you're saying that there's not a very good chance of them just taking over the country outright?
It's very unlikely. Well, for one, they don't have the, I'd say, the manpower for it, or the regional support. And two, it's definitely not a friendly territory. Like if they were semi-popular even among, like, let's say some parts of Sudan, I could see like a line where they kind of move towards the places where they have like some sympathies and hold up there and start to expand. But due to what they've been doing in Khartoum and what they've done in the past in Darfur, people are just not going to have it. They're not. They have basically no support on the ground in Sudan.
Got you. So I wanted to ask you about the Wagner Group for a second, because there was a report by CNN that was released in April that really caught my eye. Tracking some Russian planes that could have been transporting weapons to Libya to possibly be used in Sudan. I don't know if you read the exclusive or you've seen the report. If you have, okay, you have. What do you make of it? Is there any validity to these reports and the evidence that is being presented by CNN and other outlets?
Yeah, so the evidence that was presented by CNN, and there was another outlet, I can't remember it, so it would be nice if I could remember it, because they did a lot of the original reporting. They kind of tracked actually the plane as it came into Libya. And
wait. Are you telling me that CNN screwed over a smaller outlet by stealing their story? I refuse to believe
it. I mean, I'm not sure if they sold it, but definitely the original reporting, the one that tracked the plane, was not CNN. I just can't remember his name. But yes, I think all of it is factually correct. I think the only thing people don't know what was exactly in the plane. There is enough, I guess, evidence to suggest it was a mix of like possible like weaponry or tech and equipment and supplies to support the RSF. But what's not in dispute is that the Wagner Group definitely has ties to the RSF. The Wagner Group actually operates. I think part of the other reporting has shown how the Wagner Group has been operating along the RSF in the gold mining and smuggling operations in Sudan. Like the Wagner Group itself actually has, I think, some gold mines in Sudan. They've been digging basically over, I'm not sure for how long, but over the past period of time since the RSF consolidated a lot of the power.
They're in these shell companies, I assume. It's the same thing they did in the Central African Republic.
Yeah, yes, they are doing it through shell companies. And so they definitely have ties to the RSF, and they definitely have been trying to give them some supplies. And it's kind of funny because a lot of people don't know across the world. Like the first time people heard about the Wagner Group was when they did their own mutiny, kind of brief mutiny against Putin and the Russian government. But at that point, everyone in Sudan was already familiar with them due to their ties with the RSF. And there was a lot of basically memeing and joking happening about the similarities of situation where you have like this mercenary group turned militia turned paramilitary, and eventually it bites you in the back, let's say.
Yeah, I didn't want to comment on it because it kind of feels like two peas in a pod. It felt like I was seeing double a little bit when you think about it.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's there's definitely a lot of similarities there. The only thing that's not similar is they didn't end up in armed conflict in Russia. Like they managed to kind of sort it out very quickly there.
So you talked about negotiations ongoing in Saudi Arabia. Can you tell me about this?
Yeah, so there's been lots of regional efforts to reach a permanent ceasefire. It started off by the U.S. kind of supported negotiations that happened in Saudi Arabia, but those did not work out. They couldn't even get like a ceasefire for like 3 days, 3 consecutive days. So I guess then the U.S. kind of pulled out. It was like, yeah, it seems that both parties are not ready to negotiate yet, and there's not much we can do until that happens. Then some regional, more like African-centric regional powers started to try and mediate and negotiate. There was IGAD. They tried to do a conference, but the army refused to attend or send representatives because it was led by Kenya, and then they claimed that Kenya had ties with the RSF. And this is what I was saying earlier about the army not like doing foreign politics properly. But then I guess they went.
Can I ask you a question? Did they have any like ties to the RSF? Is there any truth to
mean,
that?
they might have. Definitely economically. So the RSF has a lot of economic ties to North East Africa and like Central Africa. They've been trying to, let's say, diversify their economic portfolio and have their own regional influence. So while I know they operate in some businesses in Kenya, the military has not produced anything to really suggest that the Kenyan leadership is sympathetic to the RSF.
Gotcha.
Yeah. They've not produced any specific solid evidence to do so. They just said this, that the RSF has economic interest in Kenya. As such, Kenya will be sympathetic to the RSF. That's literally what they said. But yeah, anyway, so that did not work out too well. And then there was another kind of like conference that happened in Egypt, which was much more well attended by neighboring countries, and also kind of tried to support like a peace deal or agreement. But what I heard most recently, like as recently as a couple of days ago, is that negotiations in Saudi have now started to pick up again, and the army is willing to sit for negotiations if the RSF leave like all civilian houses, because the RSF has basically occupied countless civilian houses to kind of hide away from the military and the airstrike. So if they leave civilian housing and if they leave schools and hospitals, then they will sit with them to negotiate like a permanent ceasefire.
What do you think the odds are of them actually fulfilling that command? I imagine the RSF does probably like the fact that they can use, I mean, I'm going to be blunt about it, civilians as a human shield.
No, yes, for sure. They have actually detained like thousands. I heard the most recent estimates of like they have like 5,000 detainees, which they detain them in the I guess in areas or in buildings that that are important for them, and they don't want the military to bomb. So they just detain civilians there so that the military can bomb it. But at the same time, they just randomly occupy housings. Yes, as you said, for the most part. I guess it's a bit of looting, a bit of human shields, a bit of everything. So how likely are they gonna leave? I guess if the command comes down like from the higher ups, they will have to leave. The issue is they will want guarantees that the military will not, kill them through airstrikes once they leave and group up. And that is what's being negotiated. I heard, again, this is not like particularly confirmed, but what I heard was the RSF wanted international guarantees that if they leave, the military won't strike them, like using airstrikes. And the military was like, no, we will guarantee that you will not be attacked or killed if you leave the civilian housing and the hospitals and the schools and so on, and move away.
So where does this go from here? There doesn't seem to be peace or any cessation to the conflict anywhere in the near future. There's some progress in these talks in Saudi Arabia, but these are very like preliminary. Like even if they agree on this one thing, that doesn't mean the war is over or all of this ends. Where does this go from here?
Well, the first step is a permanent ceasefire, and there have been suggestions of making Khartoum kind of arms-free zone, which the military opposes, obviously, because they'll say stuff like, sovereignty and not sovereignty and blah, blah, blah. I personally do not have any sympathies for the military because, coup and whatnot. But I guess the roadmap I've seen people suggest is first permanent ceasefire and the RSF exiting from Khartoum in particular, and then negotiation of what's going to happen next in terms of like the transition. So one of the big issues that kind of halted the transition and what sparked the war is all sides knew that you cannot have like two military forces. You cannot have like your Sudanese armed forces and this whole secondary military, the RSF paramilitary. So a lot of the tension was regarding how do you combine the two forces into one, and how long it's going to take to do so, and then where do the combined forces report to. So Hemeti was proposing 20 years, basically. He wanted to combine the RSF into the military in a 20-year period, which is obviously an absurd amount of time. It makes zero sense. And the military wanted to do it within like 2 years. And then the civilian political parties who were trying to mediate said maybe like 6 to 10 years, which is also, in my judgment, way too long. But then the other key issue was then where would the military command report to? Obviously, Hemeti did not want to report to Burhan or report to the head of the military. So his suggestion was that both of them report to the head of the transitional council, the civilian leader of the transitional council, which on paper makes sense. Like in the end, like in the US, obviously the commander-in-chief is the president, who is not a military person, but still the commander-in-chief of the army. So I guess that's what Hemeti was going for. But in practice, it would not have helped in Sudan because, yes, the commander-in-chief is the president, but also has like one general underneath him who is kind of like the head of the military. What Hemeti wanted to do was keep kind of indirectly still keep his status as as an independent general and just be parallel to the head of the military while his forces are kind of absorbed over time. So yes, in my judgment, if a permanent ceasefire is achieved, then the way forward is basically to iron out all of these kinks and figure out exactly how you're gonna get all these armed people into the military, and what Hemeti's, what's gonna happen to Hemeti. What's going to happen to Hemeti seems to be not as much as an issue recently. Specifically, I heard he was injured. There's it's not confirmed, but it's very, very likely, basically, that he was injured during one of the early skirmishes. So at this point, I think he'll be happy if he just, makes it out of this alive with his riches.
There's one more thing I wanted to ask about the rapid support forces. If their supplies are heavily reliant upon raiding these supply houses, are they gonna run out of supplies at one point? They can't do this forever if they're running out of men and material.
Yes, so their easiest source of supplies is the raids, but I've looked at the map recently of like the control, and I think they've kept one supply line towards the south, which they still have control over. But I think it's always harder for them to get supplies like from outside Khartoum because it's always open to like military airstrikes. Like so they still have a supply line they have kind of control over if they can use, I think, if needed. But obviously they'll prefer to just get their supplies from within the areas they control in Khartoum or other areas controlled by the army if they can.
Thank you very much. Is there anything else that you think we should hit on before we wrap this up?
No, I think it's we touch on all the main things. It's definitely an interesting situation, like Sudan's situation in particular. I definitely encourage people to look into it, look into like how things got here and see. In the future, you will see Sudan in the news again, whether the war stops soon or after a while, because there is a lot of political polarization due to the war. And then the next step is going to be trying to normalize the political landscape, because one of the things let's say the counter opposition parties have been doing is poisoning the opposition parties and trying to say that the opposition parties are supporting the RSF and there's a reason for the war. So that will make it much easier for the military if and when they kind of take control of.
Is there any truth to that? It wouldn't really make much sense. Is there any truth to the opposition party supporting?
I've seen very little evidence to support that. So it's all conjecture and circumstantial stuff. So they say that the opposition parties support the RSF because they're not condemning every single thing the RSF does, and they're not standing with the military. For me, the way I see it is that's likely because the opposition parties are trying to act as mediators, and obviously they cannot stand with the army if they want to stop the fighting and act as mediators. So they've been trying to play diplomatically. Again, in my opinion, they've not been doing it in the best way possible. I think you can still play diplomatically while condemning, criminal acts and condemning some of the most atrocious actions from the RSF. You can say, like, yes, obviously this is all wrong, and you should do it like frequently and consistently, while trying to get both parties together to stop the fighting. But I haven't seen nothing to suggest that they are actually allied with the RSF and that they bear any responsibility for what's happening in Sudan right now in terms of like the actual war. But yes, it will definitely lead to more military control post-war, one way or another. So definitely I hope everyone keeps their eyes on Sudan, because the next fight, once the RSF is done, I assume it's going to be a civilian military fight. It's going to be the civilian fighting against the military.
That's one thing I wanted to ask, because I got an email after our talk, and the email was asking something like, well, with all the chaos, why don't the civilians like pick up guns and like, because neither of these sides are good, they both suck so much. Why don't the civilians like overthrow? Like, it's a very simplistic view of it, but why don't the civilians like pick up guns and fight it out? How are the civilian activists who want to pursue democracy? What are they doing right now? They must be doing something.
Yeah. So there is multiple camps from what I've seen. There are the camps that are more aligned with traditional political parties. They think their role is to just mediate the stop, stop to the armed conflict, and then start another transitional period and get to the elections. Then there are the activists that are against the RSF. So they rank the RSF as an existential crisis to Sudan, and they support the military in the fight against RSF. They'll say, like, yes, military bad in general, but RSF much worse, so I'm going to support the military until the RSF is defeated completely and utterly, and then we'll see whatever we can do about the military once that is done. And then there are some people who are want to try to stick to the traditional non-violent revolutionary means, but those generally are not effective once people pick up weapons and fight. They don't want to pick up weapons and fight because it can only make things worse. Like if you start like a third party in the conflict, like if you have then the army, the armed activists, and the RSF, like that can not lead to a good situation. I get their idea is fight the RSF, and then you can more easily do like non-violent action against the military. The issue is once you have two violent parties, you get war. But non-violent action is probably more effective against the military. And Sudan, by the way, is very tribalistic. So if you just start arming a lot of people across Sudan, yes, sure, maybe you can defeat the RSF and you can kind of hold back the military. But eventually, you might end up with a situation like kind of like Libya or Syria, where just there is more fighting along like tribal and ethnic lines. Because again, Sudan has not really been like a stable state. We don't have like a proper like constitutional democracy. It's always been whoever has the most guns kind of rules. So if everyone has guns, that's just a recipe for disaster. I think nation building is going to be the next step after everything settles down and the fighting stops.
Thank you so much for taking your time to come on today's stream and to talk about this extremely important issue. Is there anything you would want people to go do? Any funds to go donate to? Any things for people to look out for?
No, I'm not familiar with any, because it's not even, I think, possible or easy. You can always obviously donate to like the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. I think they've been operating in Sudan, but there haven't been any funds that you can donate to directly in Sudan, because Sudan's cut off like from terms of like banking. You actually can't transfer money to Sudan at all directly. But yeah, if you see the Red Crescent or the Red Cross, I know they've been doing very good work trying to keep people afloat, because a lot of people have not had like the salaries in 4 months. Water, food, medicine supplies are dwindling. I think it's only through like a lot of this foreign aid that many people have been able to kind of survive this long. So yes, we would definitely appreciate it if you donate to any of these causes. And thanks a lot, obviously, for having me and shedding light on this, important yet kind of isolated topic.
Thank you so much for coming on. Please do stay in contact, and if there's ever an issue on Sudan that you think is important that should be covered, do send it my way, okay?
Yeah, will do. Appreciate it.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
What a great talk, man. That was great. I know that's not the big streamer like, oh boy, Dylan, you're talking about streamer B and how they fuck streamer. Oh boy, isn't that drama filled? Or oh, Dylan, you disagreed with streamer. Oh, debate time. But this type of stuff super, super, super important.